All right. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Lisa Versace, and I am the Programs and Engagement Manager here at the California Preservation Foundation. It is great to see an audience calling or joining us today from such diverse parts of California as well as the country. A little bit about CPF. We are a 501(c)(3) nonprofit organization providing statewide leadership, advocacy, and education to ensure the protection of California's diverse cultural heritage and its historic places. Our work is made possible by the generous support of our members, donors, and sponsors. And today's program is brought to you by our annual education sponsor, Wish Janney Elstner Associates, as well as our program sponsor, Groundwork Preservation LLC. We're joined today by guest speaker Lori Matthews, ASLA Fellow and Director of Preservation Planning and Design at MIG in Portland, Oregon. Lori will be further introduced by today's moderator, Gretchen Hilliard-Boyce. Gretchen is a historian and preservation planner with over 20 years of experience working in the public and private sectors. In addition to being the founder of Groundwork Preservation, a cultural resources consulting practice, Gretchen is a member of CPF's Board of Trustees, and she is co-chair of our Education Committee. Gretchen, I will hand it over to you to tell us a bit more about Lori.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm so happy to get to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Lori Matthews, today. And I'm going to read her full bio because it's quite impressive. So Lori is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects, and she's the Director of Preservation Planning and Design at MIG, as well as an adjunct professor with the University of Oregon's Landscape Architecture and Historic Preservation departments. She's a nationally recognized expert on cultural landscapes, helping to maintain and manage some of the most iconic historic places in the country, such as Yellowstone National Park, Point Reyes National Seashore, and Crater Lake National Park. Lori is fascinated by the complexities and stories associated with landscapes and the history they reveal, and her work is guided by the principle that landscape preservation requires managing rather than halting change. Lori holds a master's and a bachelor's degree in landscape architecture from the University of Oregon, as well as a BA from Lewis and Clark College, and she's the former president of the ASLA Oregon chapter and serves on the board of Restore Oregon. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Lori for a presentation, and then we'll have a guided Q&A, and we want to hear lots of questions from the audience at the end. Thanks, Lori.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to talk to folks about Path to Preservation because I'm going to share my screen while I'm chatting here. Because it does, I don't think I did not expect to get to this point and be doing what I'm doing when I first started off at Lewis and Clark College. So as you can see here, my talk is entitled Taking a Long Way, but Still Getting Where You Want to Go. And I think this slide in particular is really important to me because this is a team of professionals that I work with. And I think preservation requires a lot of different perspectives. And I'll show a little bit about kind of my path in terms of kind of what that means and kind of how I got to the positions that I currently hold in the world of historic preservation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, my two current positions, some tips in terms of kind of navigating the career path and kind of the decision-making process, and then end with a few greatest hits, some of my favorite projects and kind of experiences that I have had as being a part of the historic preservation community. So I'm going to start with my degree from Lewis and Clark College. I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts, but I think it's the experiences that you get at each stage of the game that have a big influence on, or should have a big influence on kind of how, kind of where your direction goes and where your path takes you. I was also editor of the college paper, so got some experience in kind of desktop publishing and writing and design, but had two really critical internships at a magazine in New York City and in a graphics kind of advertising an office at Lewis and Clark, and studied art history. Really fell in love with history at that point, and really thought I was going to kind of stay in the graphic arts. Post graduation, I had a variety of experiences that have informed my path. Initially, I was a graphic designer, kind of working on graphic communications, which is really critical to our field. Did a European tour, was also a small business owner, worked for an advertising firm, and then thought I got my dream job at Nike and decided that was not where I wanted to go. And so decided to look for other opportunities. And that's when I found landscape architecture. So I came at historic preservation through the landscape architecture lens. University of Oregon had a great kind of a way to do both landscape architecture and historic preservation, which they still have in Eugene, Oregon. But in addition to the education, and this is a professional degree, so I got a second bachelor's of landscape architecture and a master's of landscape architecture. I filled that in with things that were really history or historic preservation focused. I had a couple teaching fellowships in history of landscape architecture, a class I now teach at the University of Oregon, so coming all full circle. But overseas studies were really critical. I spent one summer in Japan, another summer in Italy. But I think the big thing that I take away from this experience and kind of all the different steps that I've taken along the path are the mentors, the people, really. The mentors. I had a patron who really supported my education and my love for historic preservation while I was at the U of O, and the community of people that I met there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Because all of those various things, my fine arts major, my graphic design experience, the people that I've met along the way, either mentors or patrons, working in advertising and owning a small business, the overseas travel, all of those things, that education, the experience, and the connections all led me to become a historical landscape architect. So it's all those things I've kind of built. It's not like I kind of let my previous career in graphic design and advertising go. A lot of the skills that I learned through that effort have really had an impact on my ability to be a historical landscape architect and kind of do it in the way that I have. So currently, my current position is, as Gretchen mentioned, I'm both the director of preservation planning and design in the consulting world, and I'm also an adjunct professor at the University of Oregon, so I'm in the academic world. All of these things require the design thinking and training that I've done, the research thinking and kind of experience that I've had, some marketing. It involves travel, it involves writing, it involves working with people. So both of those kind of experiences are similar, even though they're technically in kind of different buckets of our kind of preservation world. What that entails, I mean, you know, a lot of people, even my own father for many years did not really understand what I did, but it involves, as many of you know, research, field work, working with teams, doing design and planning, making those kinds of recommendations, evaluating these places for their historic integrity. And of course, I focus on landscapes. So my training in landscape architecture also allows me to tap into my knowledge of natural systems, wetlands, geology, you know, flora and fauna, and those kinds of things, because those are the materials of the preservation of cultural landscapes. Just like someone who specializes in historic preservation of buildings needs to understand the materials of that world, I'm kind of taking it in a slightly different direction because of my focus with cultural landscapes. So thinking about kind of where you're at in preservation, you know, I'm sure everybody on this call is at a different stage in their career, but a couple tips kind of, I think, span the gauntlet of kind of where you're at. I think one of the things to try to do is to distinguish yourself. We do all probably have a basis of kind of education and knowledge in one particular area. So that's kind of our skills, but we also bring different experiences and previous jobs to the equation. And those are kind of the ways that you can say, oh, I've done this. I've completed this. And those kinds of things can kind of help you highlight some of your key abilities. For me personally, like I've mentioned, my graphic design experience, my editing and writing experience, both at magazines and newspapers, my knowledge of historic landscapes, both from traveling overseas and also, you know, from my education at the University of Oregon, my project management experience from my time being in advertising and graphic design, that also kind of has led me to be able to go back and forth between the public and private sector. And then business development and teaching. I think we're always teaching. I think that's a part of our, you know, we're always teaching people about these historic places. So kind of working with communities and kind of exploring ideas of how to communicate the importance of these places, whether you're teaching in a formal classroom or teaching in a small group setting. Those kinds of skills kind of come to bear in terms of our ability to kind of do our work and to set yourself apart from other people who may have a slightly different constellation of key abilities and experiences. I think also, I can't probably emphasize this enough, especially, and Gretchen and I will probably talk about this a little bit later, is that the people that you meet along the way. I have, Gretchen and I have worked together side by side as colleagues. We've been, client and kind of a client relationship. So we've had all these different things. And it's amazing how those connections continue to kind of provide opportunities or provide inroads to different projects or different kind of ways of engaging with the historic preservation field. So for me personally, I had some people who supported my education early on, but I've also kept in touch with the University of Oregon and have had other university connections. Clients become colleagues, become coworkers, and you're always building kind of on your previous work. So there's no kind of kind of connection or community that you're engaged with, whether it's strictly historic preservation or not, can't kind of weave its way into your career, or help you make decisions in terms of the direction that you want to take your career. So early on, I'm kind of walk you through some of the kind of early decisions I made. So I was very lucky. I had two offers out of graduate school, and they were quite different. One was in the public sector at Mount Rainier National Park. The other one was in the private sector at a small consulting firm back east. And it was a hard decision for me, but I kind of was trying to think about, would I stay close to home, which is in the Pacific Northwest, or would I go back east? Kind of that new town, hometown kind of thing. I chose to go back east to really push myself. And I'm glad I did early in my career. I worked for a firm called Heritage Landscapes, which is one of the leading firms that does this work in cultural landscapes in the country. So I was really grateful to learn alongside another mentor. As I mentioned, mentors have been a really big part of my career and had incredible experience. Civil War, American Revolutionary battlefields, Shaker sites, kind of great estates, the U.S. Supreme Court, a variety of other kinds of projects. So it really, and I learned so much in a very short amount of time. But my heart was really with the public sector. I had, as I mentioned, I had a job offer from the National Park Service, and so my heart was really there. So I had a great opportunity to join the Olmsted Center for Landscape Preservation, based out of Brookline, Massachusetts, at Frederick Law Olmsted's house. So my office was in his house and office, which was a kind of a pinch me moment. And that's where I met Gretchen. But this was kind of going back and forth between the two. And so kind of making that determination. I'm glad I've had the experience in both. I've actually remained in private practice. These are some of the kind of projects that I got to work with when I was with the National Park Service, mainly in New England, but also did work on a project in California at Hearst Castle as part of that time in my career. But now I'm with MIG, and I've been in the consulting world for over 15 years. I think it's actually getting closer to 20, but I can't count. And this has allowed a variety of experiences with national parks, with nonprofits, with state parks and agencies. So the complexity and the variety of projects has been even greater than when I was in public service. But I still get to kind of wear that public service hat and kind of think about places in a more kind of comprehensive way. The other kind of thing that's occurred more recently is the teaching. So I now kind of do that about a quarter of my time, and it allows me to work with the next generation, landscape architects, environmental designers, historic preservation students, and it allows me the opportunity to go and see some of these amazing places around the world so that I can teach about them. So it's been a great kind of foray in these kind of later chapters. But the complexity of the work in this area is immense. These are just some of the projects that I've worked on across the country. And it really does allow you to dive into different periods of history, different resources, different challenges, and then kind of bring some of those lessons learned to bear on future projects. So I'm going to end. I know I'm kind of running over time here. Some of the greatest hits. I don't think there's anything besides historic preservation that allows you to touch history in such a kind of deep way. These are some of my best on the road offices: Hearst Castle, Sequoia National Park, a ferry going on up to Alaska, and Queen Liliuokalani's home in Hawaii. Also have had some kind of scary moments. Ellis Island is definitely one of kind of the freakiest places I've ever been, but also some of the mining kind of former industrial sites like this one in Butte, Montana, have also had some scary feelings associated with them. But also you get to see and play and be in these amazing places. A lot of national parks have incredible places to stay. Mendocino Woodlands, they are on the right in Northern California. Great project, great kind of place to stay. And then in the lower left in Katmai, Alaska. So, we get in early at the beginning of the season, typically, or the end of the season to do field work and kind of get to see these places. Sometimes not at their best because we're here to help, but some amazing experiences. And then some additional perks, just being in some of these places, seeing buffalo up close, eating the Ahwahnee, swimming in the Hearst Castle pool, seeing Lake Clark with a park ranger, and kind of getting kind of a behind the scenes experience. All of these things, because of the work that we do in historic preservation and these really special iconic places, brings us kind of closer to those experiences. But I think the big thing is kind of the hallowed ground, like witnessing history, working on projects like where Abraham Lincoln drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, seeing traditional practices in landscape, seeing Japanese American internment camps, and other kind of impacts of kind of history across the land. Drinking from springs that have been used for centuries, and then also just being in places with incredible biodiversity. I think that's what sets apart cultural landscapes from a lot of the other resources that we deal with in historic preservation. And there's just a whole world out there of things to explore. So with that, I'm going to end my formal talk and open it up for questions. I'm going to stop sharing here. I can pull the slides up if needed.
Yeah, thank you. I always love to see how your experience as a graphic designer comes through in everything you do, because I like even just your presentation was very graphically rich and I feel like very clear. And I don't even think I have a question. I just wanted to make a comment about that.
Use all the skills you've got. Yeah.
Yeah, use all the skills you've got. Yeah. I'm going to jump straight to audience questions to start because there's some good ones in here already. One of the attendees asked, why or what was critical about overseas travel in your current consulting career?
I think that I bring to projects a wealth of experience. And I think the overseas travel allowed me to see historic landscapes from a greater, wider lens than some of the ones that I've been exposed to in the United States. It allowed me to see different modes of history, different kind of ways of dealing with preservation. Like obviously the United States addresses preservation, through the Secretary of the Interior standards in a particular way. Italy addresses it much differently. Japan addresses it much differently. And that wider perspective, I think I was always interested in kind of the wider perspective of preservation. And that's why I went into cultural landscapes, is that I want to be more flexible in terms of our approach. And it's nice to see some of those ways that other countries and other communities approach preservation.
Not to mention the different time scales. Like there's just like a lot.
Well, exactly. Yeah. I mean, when
we
think, in fact, I remember one time I was in England doing research. I do some research on 16th century landscapes. And so I was there looking at those. And I came back to the United States and was working on a project at Pecos National Park. And it's the same era. It's 16th century in England. And it was 16th century in New Mexico. And I know a lot of people say, oh, America doesn't have old places and where, it's like everything's so new. Well, it's not. It's just, we haven't put that connection together. And it became clear to me because I was going from one to the next, those connections. So I think that's also very important to see those histories and layers.
Yeah. Okay. Another question here. Which would you say is the first step to do in order to get into the preservation world?
I mean, I think, to be honest, I think it's education. I mean, not all professions require what I would consider a professional degree, but I think this is one of them. I mean, I'm also trained in landscape architecture, which is also a professional degree, but I do think you need that educational training to get into the field of preservation. There are some amazing programs out there. I am grateful that I went to one that had a wide variety of things to look at, because it did allow me to, to look at landscape architecture, to look at more traditional historic preservation. I ended up with a landscape architecture degree, but focused on historic preservation. And And I know that that kind of allowed me to explore a lot of ways forward. Before I had really, I mean, now it maybe looks like, oh, I was always going to be a historical landscape architect. I was always going to specialize in cultural landscapes. And that really wasn't the case early on. I wanted to give myself a ton of opportunities to explore things. And then as I've gotten, older, I have specialized and kind of built on those experiences.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think
Would you
I know,
say the same? I mean, I don't
yeah,
know how you do it
yeah,
besides a degree. I don't think you need a
I think
master's degree
it's
necessarily, but
yeah, like it traditionally a master's degree has been the entry level into the field. I think that's changing. I think organizations, maybe more consulting and like private sector stuff, have been maybe being more open to accepting like different types of undergraduate degrees in related fields, but it is still kind of a high bar. But I think in terms of advice for people on how to like just get the foot in the door, I know like University of Oregon and some other programs have summer programs. Like USC has a summer conservation heritage program. So there's a way you could do like a smaller, see what it's like, go do a summer program somewhere, go do like a field school, where you work on a
you could
specific
also,
project.
yeah, and you could also use those field schools if you had a particular degree and it was focused on one kind of particular area of preservation. Those field schools or those summer programs could allow you a deeper dive into a different arena. I
Hmm.
mean, I teach at the University of Oregon Field School, not every year, but I am this year. And so the week I'm doing is like on cultural landscapes, but it also involves other kind of disciplines, or like photography is another thing
Hmm.
that's happening during my particular week. So that allows people to do some continuing education as well, or it gives people a kind of a look behind the scenes to see what
Hmm.
this whole field of preservation is like.
Yeah, and I think it's important to do those baby steps before jumping into a degree program because it's a huge cost, time and money. There's also internship opportunities, like when I was I think between like a freshman year of college, I did an internship for my local national park, unpaid, which, now I say don't do an unpaid internship, but it was unpaid, but it was just a way to get some project experience. I wrote a National Register nomination for a beautiful historic farm. And, there are internship opportunities that hopefully are accessible to people. I know cost can be an issue if you're unpaid or, try and get funded to do it, but any experience you can get with projects to start to see if you like it before maybe committing down a career path.
Yeah, I think
Um,
internships in particular have been the thing that just those kind of summer experiences were for me early on, really helped me kind of find my way to what I really wanted to do. And I do think that I know the landscape is changing in terms of what the opportunities are in preservation, given what's happening at the federal government level. But
mhm,
that doesn't mean there are still opportunities out there through the Student Conservation Association, through NICP. And there's a fairly good database or good website through the federal government that lists some of those opportunities, and
mhm,
those are still out there. I still am seeing listings for good kind of work experiences.
mhm. I'm going to jump down to JR's question because it's related. JR saying, what would you recommend to a person who has no experience in the preservation world and is considering a career change into historic preservation?
I think actually what you just said, some of the field schools and the summer programs, I think that's a really good way to just kind of take a peek around the curtain. And then again, some of these, if you are able to take, kind of move positions to a kind of a temporary position like the SCA or the NICP, those are the ones that I think give you the most experience. I mean, the field schools are always going to be, or the summer programs maybe a little more hands-on than would be a typical person's historic preservation work, because we do it, it's kind of one or the other. You're either out in the field all week or you're like at your desk and like writing and doing research. So there's a real
Hmm.
switch between the duties and kind of the tasks. But I do think that those types of opportunities give you a window in. I do think there's some online programs too. I'm not totally up to speed on kind of who is still around and doing those, but you could take a class or two at a local at an online, or a school that has a broader reach in terms of online education,
Hmm.
just to kind of get a sense of what those things are.
Yeah, I know Goucher College, I think, has a online historic preservation program, or at least they did a few years ago.
They
That might be.
did, and that's what. Yeah, I almost mentioned that one, and I'm not quite sure what the current status is, so I
Mhm.
apologize that I don't know that,
Yeah, I
but
think since
that's
COVID, a
something to
lot of
look into.
Since
Yeah.
COVID, a lot of those programs have shifted. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to jump into an excellent question from Dorothy that I'm sure you have lots of thoughts on. Please comment on the impact of climate change on cultural and historic landscapes. Briefly,
This,
you could
yeah,
talk about this, but
I could. I mean, this is literally all that we are addressing right now in terms of preservation treatment recommendations. And I was very, speaking of mentors, I was incredibly fortunate that my professor, Robert Melnick, who was at the University of Oregon and who was also, he was a professor, he is a friend, he's been a colleague. Like we have had a similar kind of trajectory where we've worked together on multiple fronts. He thought about this early on. But I also think that, not to tout cultural landscapes, but I do think that the way that cultural landscape preservation looks at historic preservation is a little bit more flexible, is the way forward in dealing with some of these climate change issues. So, for example, almost every single plan that we're doing is dealing with it. At Crater Lake recently, we were working with like wildfire in particular and kind of ways to manage, like keep the historic character of the relationship between the buildings and the plantings, but also put into protections around the buildings themselves, but also make recommendations about which plants are less or more flammable. And we could still preserve the character of that relationship between natives and the kind of the NPS rustic buildings, but we're using different materials or we're spacing materials differently so that the wildfire risk is not as high. So that's just one example of kind of small moves that we can make to the resources that don't impact the historic character, but provide a little bit more protection.
mm-hmm.
I could go on and on. I could talk about
Yeah.
wetlands till the cows come home in terms of that being the solution for dealing with sea level rise and storm intensity. And if we continue to build over our wetlands, we are going to be in a whole world of hurt. But that's one of the main recommendations I make to address that particular issue. You're right.
Yeah.
I can talk about this till forever.
It's so timely and so important. I'm going to
Yeah.
jump to Joseph's question because it's related, but it kind of leads in a different direction. He's asking, how can we spread the word beyond the field of historic preservation and bring the idea of cultural landscapes to the general public? You kind of touched on that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this because I think it's
Yes.
important.
Yeah, so I think it's online. I gave a talk last fall at the University of Pennsylvania. They convened an incredible array of people who are engaged in preservation of cultural landscapes in particular, from the beginning of kind of the nascent stages of cultural landscapes to today. And if that talk would be great, because I do address the fact that we need to look at other kind of allied disciplines. I'm going to call out the environmental movement in particular, where they've used legal challenges, where they have they've won the hearts and minds of people in terms of caring about the natural environment. I hate to separate the two, at least in my world, because I see them as the same thing. Like a lot of the materials that I am addressing in terms of whether or not they are historic or not, or whether or not they deserve protection or not, they're both cultural and natural. It's just the lens that we put on them, but we just haven't kind of flipped that for people to understand that relationship between humans and their environment, and that what we value can be a natural resource. It's just a different, kind of a different lens. So I do look at the environmental movement and how they have used legal challenges, number one, and kind of the legal kind of complexion of things to get things moving forward. But I think we need to just talk about how humans and the environment are integrally linked, and they're not two separate things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think some of the disconnect too is that it's complicated, like it's layered, it's systems based, and it's not like, and again, I do both architectural preservation and cultural landscape preservation, but like architectural preservation is a little bit easier for people to understand. And I think cultural landscapes in concept is more complicated. And so there's a disconnect there. And I think we need to do a better job at like communicating and PR, to be honest, just of like why it's important. And we don't have all the answers here, but
We don't have all the answers, but it's so complex. I mean, it goes back to like kind of our root belief systems in a variety of ways. So it's not going to be solved overnight, but we do just need to continue to impress upon people that we preserve what we value, whether it's a cultural resource or a natural resource or whatever bucket you put in, and think about making that argument.
Mhm. Okay, more good questions from the audience here. Back to the top. Can you give us a least favorite or good national park experience from a preservation perspective so far? Could be for whatever reason.
Um, Actually, I'm going to talk about it a little more generally. I think, I mentioned that I have experience working in preservation kind of throughout the world. And I think that the National Park Service and the Secretary of the Interior's models are an incredible foundation. What I have seen moving forward in my work with the National Park Service as less flexibility in addressing resources from a holistic perspective, and kind of um, not not being able to embrace creative thinking when it comes to preservation of resources in the national parks because the regulatory framework is pretty strict in my view. I think that also with the caveat that I think other cultures who have a longer, deeper just recognition of their own history, not to say that we don't have the same length of history we do in the United States, but it's not recognized as such. It's so that's a part of the issue. I think if you are live in a culture that has a deeper connection to history or reverence for history, then you can be more flexible. And I think that the United States is not quite there yet. And I think the Park Service is responding to that kind of complexion. But I would like to see the Park Service take bigger, bolder moves. And and this is just another kind of trend I've seen is that it's easier to say no. And we sometimes box ourselves into a position where the only solution moving forward is not the best position. And then because there isn't the right or kind of the most perfect solution moving forward, we abandon and we just kind of like take our hands off and don't do anything. Well, that's a decision as well. But I think we can be more proactive and try and experiment with things, even in national parks where there is a fairly strict, in my opinion, regulatory framework. Not to say that, I mean, I do think, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Park Service's guidelines, just looking at them, are some of the best in the world. It's just the practice of putting them into practice has become a little more stringent.
Okay, we have
the question.
Yeah. We have 3 votes here for you to answer this question. Can you elaborate about what was scary about both Ellis Island and Butte, Montana, and why it was scary for you?
Yes, I can. Number one, don't do field work on your own. That's what I did at Ellis Island, so don't do that. Ellis Island, so I wasn't doing field work on the island that's open. There are actually 3 islands to Ellis Island. If you didn't know that, I didn't know that before going in. Islands 2 and 3, which were added as the over time to deal with the issues that immigrants, coming to the country had. Some of them were sick, some of them had mental illness, some of them, there was a variety of things. Some of them, unfortunately perished on the way over. All of those things needed a larger infrastructure, hospitals, a crematorium, places for people to live while they were recuperating from a particular illness that they caught on the way to the United States. All those things, that infrastructure is part of Islands 2 and 3. I was there doing field work on my own, and I had 2 kind of things that happened. One was I thought I heard someone coming up from behind me, like walking. It's kind of like a gravel path. I turned around, there was nobody there. Okay, let that go. But then someone at the park told me that, that was kind of a thing that other people have experienced. So, believe what you will. The other thing is I was rounding the corner of a building, and I unfortunately came across the nesting pair of geese. And one of them was really not excited to see me, but very excited. He started flapping his wings. I tripped and fell over it, almost went into the East River, almost fell over the seawall on my own. If I had done that, I would have had to swim all the way around the island. So it was an adventure, to say the least. I think the Butte, Montana, just those industrial sites that are kind of abandoned, like They're creepy. That was like a head house, like someone was controlling some kind of equipment, but to me it looked like an electric chair. I don't know. So that was
Mm.
I think you just have there are spirits of place out there. I fully believe that. And a lot of those places are the places that we work in, because they have so many layers of kind of interaction with humanity. And sometimes that's a beautiful thing, and sometimes it can be a little creepy.
Ghost stories.
Ghost stories.
Everyone
Everybody has
has
them in
them.
this.
Yeah,
Everybody
everyone has
has
them
them in
in
this
our
field.
field.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the CPF conference programs a couple years ago, they did like a ghost storytelling night, and it was very enlightening. All right, I'm going to jump to Allison's question here. Do you think it's possible to be a consultant in the landscape historic preservation field without working for a firm?
I think you can have your own business, for sure. I think you can also do some consulting or kind of project work if you are associated with a university. I mean, that's actually becoming a lot more common where people who are teaching also have kind of side, not really side gigs necessarily, but they are doing project work through a university arrangement. I did some of that work actually for the University of Oregon. Um, uh, don't do it now because it's a little bit of a conflict of interest, but they were specific projects that we were trying to move some methodologies forward that deal with cultural landscapes and climate change. So it was more of a kind of an education research projects that were focused on kind of a research and education thing. But yeah, you don't have to work for a consulting firm for sure. Gretchen can wax poetic about this because she has her own firm. But I do think, but the other avenue besides opening up a small business is to do some teaching and have kind of a university agreement as well. That's another way to do that, the work.
Yeah, and I would just add that if you're specifically trying to work for the National Park Service, the way that they do their contracting is quite complicated, and usually it's larger firms that hold these large scale contracts that go cover many years. And so unless you're on one of those teams, you can't access that work. So I think that's where the relationship building is really important, and like finding other firms to team with if you're independent, or going through universities because they have these NGO sort of ways of contracting, things like that is important.
Small businesses are an attractive um, teammate though, because there's a lot of times where projects are set aside for those who qualify. So
Mhm.
that's, a small business is a good way to increase your kind of skills, or what your
Mhm.
what distinguish you. Hence my earlier slide.
Yeah,
Know how to
exa-
distinguish yourself. Yeah.
exactly. Okay, there's another question here. Why is a master's no longer the best or minimum threshold professionally? I think I was the one who said that. I was trying to make the point that I think, like when I was doing hiring for big firms, we were trying to broaden our pool of candidates and realizing that there are people that have maybe an undergraduate history degree who have some experience in the field that would be good candidates for, an architectural historian position or something like that. And so by limiting it to you must have a master's degree in this field, you sort of cut out a large potential percentage of your candidates. And so I think mostly firms are starting to look a little bit more broadly and consider people that don't have master's degrees. It's still definitely the assumed entry point into the field. Like if you don't have a master's degree, it's a little bit hard to apply for many jobs, especially federal jobs and government positions.
Yeah, I'll
Is
just add
your
to that.
experience?
Yeah, I'll add to that. I do think that, yes, I mean, I'm just going to speak personally. So the classes I teach at the University of Oregon, it's not just historic preservation students. It's not just landscape architecture students. It's architecture, environmental design, environmental science, kind of ethnography or anthropology. So all of those allied fields could be involved in historic preservation projects moving forward. Same with the people that I work with. So at MIG or MIG, whatever you want to call it, I have my team is called the Cultural Places Studio, and it's not all people who are trained in preservation. It's not all people who are trained in landscape architecture. It's a little bit of both. It's sometimes people who have come at it from a non-traditional way, but they can write and they're good at analysis, or they can do graphics, or like there's a whole array of skills that people bring to this work. And I don't think that we as a team would be able to serve our clients as well if we didn't have that full array of the skills and expertise. Everybody has a little bit something different to bring to the table, and the collection of those skills is what makes us, able to help people and help clients and help historic places be the best that they can be. But I will
Yeah.
say it is a technical degree. I mean, there is a kind of
Mhm.
a basis of understanding about the Secretary of Interior standards and preservation law and materials and those kinds of things. Those, you'll need to get that training or experience somewhere. You can't do it without it, but you might be able to do it without the education. It's just going to be harder.
Mhm. Yeah, and like you even on your team, you have like people that are GIS mapping specialists, and sometimes we team with architecture firms a lot. And so there's like all kinds of, it's very multidisciplinary. So there's ways to like get into it without necessarily having like a historic preservation degree or a landscape architecture degree, but in some cases those are the easiest way to break in.
Yeah, planning degree. I have people on my team who are just have straight up planning degrees, but they're so good at like all the little kind of analysis pieces. Like, I mean, preservation is can be so micro in terms of like features and history. I mean, it's just very detail oriented, and some people who have planning degrees are so good at that kind of organization of data. And so that is huge, incredibly important for some of the projects that we worked on.
Mhm. Here's a question. Can you share your thoughts on the overlap of preservation and design, specifically in how we can preserve while adapting for future change while remaining relevant?
Yes. I mean, I fully believe that any place that is has activation is going to be better than one that's mothballed. So, anytime we can have people living or working in a historic building or having a historic landscape be kind of actively, engaged with, those are the places that I think are the life is still there, and the preservation of those resources is actually a little bit easier, even if the current use is not exactly what it was there historically. I mean, it has to be compatible. It should be, something that isn't going to have a negative impact. How we do that, I mean, that's the fun of this. Like, even though the methodology of research and analysis and developing recommendations is a fairly common kind of path to getting to the answer of what do we do with this place. The what do we do with this place is totally different based on so many different kind of what you have, where you're going, what kind of resources do you have. So that's where I think you have to just be kind of flexible and creative in thinking about how much change can we accommodate without losing kind of that historic character, but not be afraid of experimenting with things and thinking about, kind of, is some change is going to be fine. It's going to, maybe this is because I work with landscapes. Landscapes change regardless of what you do. They are a changing resource. And so inherently, you have to think about just kind of directing that change in a way that you value. And obviously, I'm going to try to look at one that values whatever the kind of major historic presence is on that place, or what the kind of the major kind of stories are that need to be told, and using that as the guiding force in terms of making those decisions, moving it forward. I
Mm.
mean, we could talk about the Brandy Station Battlefields, a project that Gretchen and I are working on together right now. And obviously the Civil War battle is like the primary story, but there's so many others there. And I mean, we're not to the decision-making process by any stretch of the imagination, but we can start to make decisions that preserve elements of the battle while also thinking about and preserving other stories that are in that landscape that are just as important to tell.
hmm Yeah, and that's largely driven because that site has recently become Virginia's newest state park. And so as a state park, it has a different mandate than when it was just a privately owned, battlefield. It's like they're looking to tell a bigger story there, which is
Yeah.
really exciting. Um, Great. Okay. Question about current government priorities. So, given the current federal government priorities as reflected in its budget and ethics, how has your outlook on the historic preservation profession changed? How will your teaching and curriculum adapt to these changes at the federal level? That's a good question.
Yeah. It's a great question. I change my curriculum every single time I teach. I mean, there's a basic foundation, but I'm always bringing in new scholarship, new examples, new, kind of thinking on these topics. You can't, I mean, preservation may seem to some like something that is, stuck in amber. It's not. At the federal level, I think there's never been a time where history isn't more important, where telling the story of our past is more important. It is going to be harder to tell that story and get through the noise. There's no denying that. And it's going to be harder if the current federal resources are not matched by private um, resources that come from some other place. And that there are some other, I mentioned the environmental movement earlier on. Obviously, they've had those types of efforts have had a great deal of federal and public funding, but there's also a significant amount of private funding that has gone into those efforts as well. Now is the time for private funding to step up if people feel that they value history. And I think it's going to be the thing, especially tangible history, is just so much more impactful than telling a story. If you could tell the story in the place and see the story kind of, in a 360-degree view around you, it's going to have a bigger impact. But the story's not being told, or it's not being told accurately at this point. And that is, I think, for me, that's the biggest mission moving forward in terms of the work and where I take this next phase of my career. I will say, I've worked public sector, private sector, and I have worked with a lot of different clients, but my number one client is the landscape itself. I always look to what is the best move forward for this particular landscape. Like that's who I'm doing this work for. That's the main goal. And telling the history moving forward is going to be the biggest challenge we have, but it's also going to have the biggest reward for us if we can be successful.
Okay, slightly different question here. Who was your first mentor that led you on your path? You kind of mentioned.
Oh, I did. It's actually two. Oh gosh, is it three? Okay, I'm gonna say two. Robert Melnick and Kenny Helfand were both professors at the University of Oregon. Now, I had decided to go there based on my knowledge, very cursory, of them and their experience and expertise. And I was grateful that I, got to uh, learn from them and work with them and, collaborate with them on multiple things up until today. I will say too, I chose that program in part because of them. I had no idea at the time that they would have the impact upon me that they have had. I will say too that almost every single career decision that I've made, there has been someone or maybe more than one person that I have chosen to work with. I feel mentorship is a huge piece of this, and I would not be where I am today without the people that I have worked with or alongside. I think one of the other big early supporters of me were Sue and Mort Fuller. I had worked for Sue actually in the advertising business before going back to school, and it's circumstances changed, or certain things led to they own 250-acre property designed by the Olmsted brothers, and so asked me to consult on that during graduate school, and then also asked me to do a project at another Olmsted design for them. And so that gave me some really good early experience, and they helped fund some of the travel and research that I needed to do for that. So it was a huge stepping stone for me in terms of getting experience in the field. From there, every firm I've had, every place I've worked with, I've had mentors that have been incredibly valuable to me. But those were the two early ones were Robert and Kenny.
Yeah. You've done such a great job at like keeping in touch with those folks and everything. And I'm just curious, like, do you have any tips for that? Because like all of them you're still working with or directly in contact with. And I know that's not always so easy.
It's not. I I don't know what I just keep in touch with them. You know, and time can go by, you know, and you don't keep in touch with people, but then, you know, you reach out and you say hi and you know what how you doing. And I mean LinkedIn, I kind of pooed that social network early on, but that's become a really great way to kind of connect with people. um I guess I just show up or I'm there. I just I don't know, I just keep in touch.
But you're being proactive about it,
Yeah,
it sounds like.
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean these are very important people in my career and life, and I can't imagine, you know, not still being in touch with them.
Mhm. Okay. This next question, I want to ask it, but I might redirect it slightly. So
Okay.
Louise is asking, do you think it's important to push for projects to local politicians to get funding for historic preservation? Do you recommend that at the state level too? I guess maybe more broadly, where are you seeing funding sources for preservation projects? How is that shifting and where might people advocate for funding? You've already said private funding. This is
I
talking
have
specifically about public funding.
I have said private funding. I do think that's an untapped resource for us. But in terms of public funding, I do think state parks are going to be an area where more work is being done. I think they have an amazing collection of resources that they don't always know what to do, or not all agencies, you know, kind of have a smooth path forward. So I think that that would be a good one. And I think actually cities and nonprofits, like I think we would be surprised at how many historic resources are not owned by the National Park Service and are on, you know, kind of city, municipal, state, county lands. It's just that those agencies don't have traditionally the deeper bench or the mandate to protect them in the same way that the Park Service has traditionally done. Obviously, things have changed, and whether or not that mandate moves forward. The other thing that's interesting about, you know, if you're reading through kind of the Project 2025 like plan, is that one of their ideas is to offload a lot of National Park Service properties to state and local agencies. I obviously don't think that that's a great idea, because as I mentioned, the Park Service really has had and will at least still has, I think, to the deeper bench of expertise that can manage those places. But if that does start to happen, then it's those agencies that are going to need the support of people who have you know, experience in these realms, because agencies, even in the National Park Service, you know, individual parks don't typically have people with preservation expertise unless they're a larger park like Yosemite or Yellowstone. So they work with regional offices, and because that's where the expertise is, and then they kind of go and work with different people. The same would be true for kind of state parks and local agencies.
Mhm. Great, thank you. This is an excellent question. How often do you engage with Indigenous groups in historic preservation or just generally in your work? And maybe you can give an example.
Yes, I uh, it's varied. We should be doing it on every single project because every landscape has an associated group of people who are First Peoples and who have, you know, have a really strong relationship with that land. It doesn't always happen because of a variety of things. Typically, you know, client relationship, funding, kind of relationship with tribes, that kind of thing. Those are some of the impediments that I have seen. Um, and you know, and I'm talking about my personal experience. So in some of the National Park Service projects that I've worked on, they have a federal mandate to work with the tribes that are associated with those landscapes. Sometimes the park is doing that on a very regular basis, and other times it's not. And so it's up to us to kind of form some of those relationships. But it really shouldn't be a consultant who is forming those relationships. It should be someone who has a longer kind of ability to have those relationships, and that's where things get, you know, kind of tricky. um for example, we are working in San Diego County right now with a variety of tribes there. I can't talk too much about the specifics of the relationship, but you know, the public agency was doing the right thing by trying to engage the tribes, but there's just been a lot of, you know, it's kind of like you think you're at a particular starting point in talking with tribes and getting a sense of kind of what the history and their relationship to the land is. And then that you need to kind of move like 5 steps backwards and start at the beginning and start to move forward. So that's the biggest disconnect that I see, and public agencies just don't have, just haven't had that kind of build up. My firm does have a tribal nations, native nations building studio. So we're actually trying to get on the front end of some of those relationships and working with tribes more directly so that we can start to have some of those conversations prior to other types of projects that I might be involved in. But every single situation is different, and it's about connection, and it's about working with people who already have a relationship with the tribe. I think one of the tips that I learned early on was you want to have someone who is a tribal member on the team or on kind of that you can work with, but probably not someone who is a member of the particular tribe that you're working with. Someone who has some kind of objectivity, because some of the projects that I worked on a project here in Oregon at Willamette Falls, and it involves multiple tribes in Oregon because it was such a place of gathering for multiple tribes, both recognized and non-recognized. And not all of those tribes, just like any group of people, get along. They all have a different perspective on ownership and relationship and history of that place. And so you need someone to kind of try to bridge some of those ideas and conversations. And you're in it for the long haul. This is a long conversation. And I don't think the consultant to client relationship is the best way to make some of those inroads. It can have an impact on kind of the future and kind of can make some positive impacts. But the real relationship building needs to be happening not in those kind of short project contract kinds of relationships.
With arbitrary timelines, like that have nothing
arbitrary
to do.
timelines. Yeah. I mean, I will say we're working on a project at Battle of the Little Bighorn, and it's on pause right now because we're waiting for some of those relationship building conversations to occur before we can get to the point where our expertise is going to be helpful or valuable in those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there's 2 more questions here I'm going to take. So kind of related, Andrea's asking, it seems we need archaeology experience and or museum experience, even with a heritage conservation master's. How do we get that? And then someone responded, as someone with both history and archaeology degrees, I've actually experienced an unexpected amount of tension between the specialties, a perception that archaeologists can't write building records or that historians don't understand landscape. So just, that's kind of a lot, but curious what you think about those questions.
Yes. I mean, I would love it if, as allied disciplines, we could all understand what we bring to the table, but there is concern that, one group is trained in one thing and doesn't see the bigger perspective in another, and that can happen. You can specialize and kind of lose sight of kind of what I mean. I will say personally, I know what I do well and I know what I don't do well. Hence the reason I still work at a firm, and hence the reason I have a team, because everybody with those different kind of specific areas of training does bring something different to the conversation. And I think depending on where you're at in your career, if you want to move into something that is, I mean, I sometimes I'm like, wait, should I have become an archaeologist? Should I go back to school and become an archaeologist? Like, I think about this all the time. I'm like, should I add one more thing, one more like little letters to the end of my name? Probably not. But I do think that there is something to be said about looking at this work and looking at the resources that we protect from a different lens. And if you don't have that particular training or experience or expertise, finding someone who does. But also realizing that other people who have been trained in other kind of elevators or whatever the word is, they have something to bring to the table. So just kind of recognizing that there are differences of experiences and expertise and skills, and recognizing where you might want to take your career if you want to move into a direction like that, or if you need to bring someone to work with to learn those kinds of things. So a little more empathy and understanding would be great.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to try to get through these questions. I know we're over time, but I'm going to go. And Jackie, sorry I've skipped your question so far, but it's because I wasn't sure how to frame this, but I think I am now. So Jackie's asking for someone who's starting out in planning but has an interest in urban design and architecture. Let's add landscape architecture. What experiences and skills do you recommend developing early on?
Writing and graphics. I would say I see two groups of people that I work with the most. Some of them are great writers and some of them are great at graphics. If you can do both relatively well, you are the sweet spot. I think the trick is that I think we understand most people can do research and kind of understand what you've got there. I mentioned a little bit earlier about someone being able to handle all the data. There's a lot of data associated with historic preservation and kind of organizing it in a way that is clear. And that's actually the main point I want to make here is that one of the things that we can be doing better is clearly communicating what's important. We get so wrapped up in the details and the amount of information that is out there that I think we're doing a disservice to these places and to our clients by not being able to like distill it into something that is like super identifiable. Graphics are that thing. So if you can write clearly and succinctly and you can develop graphics that clearly illustrate a point and allow people to see why something is important or what has changed over time or kind of what the kind of the big picture idea is, you found the secret sauce, and I would encourage people to get those skills.
Hmm. Good answer. Okay, Alicia is saying, I think there's something to be said about having jobs and experiences that are not a good fit. It's so essential starting out. Curious if you have any insights on that. Hi, Lori.
Oh, hello. Yes, I've had a couple jobs that were not great fits. I still learned things from them. I learned how to work with difficult people. I learned how to make decisions that kind of, you know, uh, I think honestly, one of the things that the reason I've left some jobs maybe earlier than I might have was the people I worked with. I just think that if you're working with a good team of people, it makes everything easier. But I think that difficult experiences are also good. It makes you learn a lot about yourself, what you can improve, what you might love that you're not getting to do at that particular opportunity. And it allows you to pivot. I think I mentioned early on, I thought I'd gotten my dream job when I was a graphic designer, and I just it didn't feel it was like this is not the right path for me. And I used that and said, okay, I need to figure out what the next stage of my career is. And that's when I made the switch to what I do now. So those moments are just as it's invaluable. Yeah, making mistakes also very helpful because you learn a ton from them. I don't think we allow ourselves to make enough mistakes and to admit like, oh yeah, whoops, I made a huge boo-boo here. But I learned from it. I'm not gonna do it again. So I think those are big learning experiences and we should embrace them.
Okay, last question, I promise. We're making you go the whole time here. How
No,
would
it's
you
fine.
deal with historical controversy? For example, is it better to tear down a statue of a historically, quote, bad person because he or she does not deserve to be memorialized, or is it better to keep it as a permanent reminder of how low humanity can be?
There is no right or wrong answer to this one. I have a whole class on this particular subject matter. Context is everything. I think erasing history can lead to mistakes, but I also think that not contextualizing something that is offensive to large groups of people is also a mistake. So, for example, I actually use this example quite a bit. Europe has not forgotten World War II. The Holocaust, the devastation that people went through during those years during World War II is front and center almost everywhere you go if you're looking closely. That is not the case in the United States. And so I think, and I'm not going to talk too politically here, but I think that the immediacy of the lessons from World War II are just not as a part of the American kind of consciousness as much as it is in Europe. And I think that's because, number one, the war didn't happen with the exception of Hawaii, it didn't happen in a couple places on the West Coast. It didn't happen as much in the United States. We don't have the immediacy. But I think not recognizing history, both the good, the bad, and the ugly, allows us to put it out of mind. So I don't necessarily, I don't think that there's a yes or no answer to the removal of monuments or statues or plaques. I think there's a way to do it in a way that recognizes those painful moments in our history and contextualizing them so we learn from them.
Great answer and good one to end on. Thank you so much. I want to just mention
Thank
a
you.
plug. CPF, we're hosting a Cultural Landscapes boot camp starting on Thursday. It's a 2-week, 2 different sessions, and some of Lori's colleagues from MIG are going to be speaking, as well as I'll be moderating. And just a lot of the things that were brought up today, we're going to cover in depth in that training. So I hope some of you might consider joining the boot camp. Starts on Thursday. And I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to wrap us up. And thanks everyone for staying a few minutes over too.
Great.
And thank you, Lori.
Yes, thank
You're
you.
welcome. Thank you for having me.
I also echo Gretchen, especially in your answer to the last question. I think it's an incredibly complicated topic, and I think your answer was very well put. So a huge thank you to Lori for being so generous, sharing your time with us, rocking us through your journey, and really sharing not just your journey, but so many personal and professional insights with us. I think this was just an incredible conversation. And so very pleased to have you. Of course, thank you to Gretchen for your excellent moderating skills, as always. Everyone in our audience, we're so glad that you joined us today. Hope you enjoyed this program. We have many more programs on the horizon. As Gretchen mentioned, in case your interest is piqued by today's conversation, we will have 2 of Lori's colleagues joining us starting on Thursday for a two-part boot camp, which Gretchen will be moderating as well as participating in presenting. In a few weeks, we have another lunchtime presentation with Los Angeles history blogger Eitan Rosebloom of Eitan Does LA. You can learn more about these programs at californiapreservation.com/programs. I will also drop the direct link into the chat. Again, a huge thank you to Lori and Gretchen. And on behalf of myself, CPF staff, and our education co-chairs, thank you to everyone for being here. We hope to see you at a program soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.